Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Hashim Kumar. EU leaders and experts, including sanctions envoy David O'Sullivan, are in Washington this week to coordinate with US counterparts on Russia. At stake are two big issues: whether to move forward with new sanctions and how to handle the 210 billion euros in frozen Russian assets. President Trump has hinted at a new phase of restrictions while Europe remains split. To unpack the legal and political challenges, we're joined by Yulia Ziskina. She's senior legal expert at Razom for Ukraine. Ms. Ziskina, welcome to TVP World, and thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, it's a pleasure. So I mean, morally speaking, it seems the argument seems very clear. We have Russian assets within the European Union. Russia is the aggressor in Ukraine. It seems only fair that they pay for the damage they cause. What's the problem?
You're entirely right. It's very clear. And EU leaders and, in fact, G7 leaders as a whole have said that these assets will not be returned to Russia until Russia compensates Ukraine for the damage that it has inflicted. However, reasonably speaking, we can all likely agree that Russia will never voluntarily compensate Ukraine. So the question becomes, do third-party countries, such as the EU and other G7 countries, essentially force Russia to compensate Ukraine? There have been numerous objections to this, most of them based on misunderstandings. Of course, the legal basis is still not fully understood, despite much research having been done on this. There are financial concerns as well, which have also been debunked by numerous economists at this point. And so largely it has become an issue of political will and inertia. But recently, the European Commission has made strides towards potentially moving in the direction of using these frozen assets.
Okay, now let's talk through the legal bases that are holding up the use of these assets. What are the legal bases? I mean, it is quite an unusual situation, is it not, to use frozen assets held by a third party, to repair the damage done by an aggressor. So what is stopping the funding, legally speaking?
Well, it's not as unusual as some might think. And first, let me explain the legal basis. There is a doctrine in international law that has been developed specifically for situations like this, called third-party state countermeasures. The idea of countermeasures is that they permit countries to take acts that would normally be unlawful, such as interfering with another sovereign's property, but they become lawful, or they are justified in the sense that they are meant to return the aggressor state into compliance with international law. So on this basis, it's a way of enforcing international norms. And when an aggressor country has committed breaches of international law that are so egregious that it affects the entire global community, third-party countries can take those countermeasures on behalf of the victim country without being directly at war with the aggressor itself. This has been explained in numerous memos, statements to governments. But the holdup here legally is that you are right. We have never been in exactly this kind of situation before. We have had analogous situations, such as in 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait. The US, Britain, and France confiscated the assets of Iraq in order to compensate the victims of that invasion. There were some differences there, but what we haven't had before are hundreds of billions of dollars frozen in Western countries and an aggressor country that has committed the worst breaches of international law since World War II. So while we don't have an exact blueprint, history rarely gives us something like that. We have to create history and we have to create precedent itself. And extreme circumstances like this necessitate taking bold action in order to craft the future and the international law of the future that we want to uphold.
Understood. Now, you mentioned earlier that what's missing is political will to do it. Let's assume the political will does eventually align towards using these assets. What happens to actually, put them to use?
There are numerous things that can be done with them. So first of all, Ukraine needs defense. As some of your viewers likely know, there was the Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Loan, which was provided to Ukraine to be repaid with the future interest on the frozen assets. This $50 billion loan is running out by the end of the year. So the next step that the European Commission is talking about is putting these assets into a special purpose vehicle in order to invest them in riskier investments and generate higher returns for Ukraine in order to develop that defense funding. However, of course, an important part of this is compensation and reparations for the victims of Russia's unlawful invasion, many of whom have lost their homes, have been displaced, lost family members. When we speak about ending the war, we cannot forget this important element of it, because there cannot be peace without justice for the victims.
So there's no restriction on how these funds may be used. They might be used for military purposes, but also for reparations and rebuilding. Is that correct?
Of course, the answer is usually it depends. It is more legally sound to use the profits on the assets for defense, but the assets themselves, under international law, are already owed to the victims of Russia's invasion. So it is a much more clear legal basis to use the principal amount of the funds themselves for compensation and for reparation to the victims. And in fact, the Register of Damage is already created under the auspices of the European Council. This is meant to create a compensation mechanism for the victims. And the idea is that the compensation will be paid out through the frozen Russian assets.
Understood. Now, I'd like to move on now to the European delegation that has gone to Washington to discuss tightening up the sanctions. What do you think the next moves are going to be?
It remains to be seen. As mentioned earlier, the Trump administration has said that they're looking forward to the new phase of sanctions. However, that begs the question of what the initial phase was. There have been numerous deadlines put forth by the current Washington administration, none of which we've seen come to fruition. So the question remains, are these merely words? But I would challenge that the bigger strategic absurdity here, and I would like us to maybe take a step back. While it's admirable that EU leaders are trying to diplomatically work with Washington, I think the time has come for the EU and the UK to take that leadership role. It is unclear if we can rely on the US at this stage. And fundamentally, it's really kind of absurd that 500 million prosperous Europeans continue to rely on 350 million Americans for their security, as if the world hasn't changed since 1949. It's also very absurd that 140 million Russians, most of whom are much poorer than their European counterparts, continue to dictate the terms to a continent whose economy is 12 times the size of Russia. So I would challenge that, yes, there is value in coordinating with our G7 allies. However, we haven't even seen this first phase of sanctions. So the question is, how much longer do we wait? And the longer we wait, the more this emboldens Russia, as we have seen given its recent record-breaking attack of a combined 800 drones and missiles onto Kyiv.
Indeed, some excellent questions there. We look forward to their answers. Yulia Ziskina, thank you so much for your analysis and sharing it with our audience. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. You as well.
Thank you. Bye-bye. That brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, lots more coming up. Goodbye.